applications about, to trust the use of these systems. So in some ways, making sure that technologies we build are value responsive will help engender trust, but that's not all there is to developing trust. So it's one thing to tell you as an ethicist who cares a lot about the ethical ramifications of technology that your goal should be value responsiveness trust, but I recognize that's not such an easy task. How do we do that? Well, to achieve the goal of value responsiveness and trust, it's essential that we develop actionable guidance, assessment tools, and an accountability infrastructure. Learning that you need to ensure that your algorithmic powered tools are fair, transparency, privacy preserving, et cetera, is not useful unless we develop more specific guidance, ways to assess whether we're living up to our commitments to follow that guidance. And it's going to be hard to engender trust without some form of accountability infrastructure that makes clear that real work is being done to achieve ethical AI rather than empty platitudes or ethics washing. So if those are our goals, let's talk a little bit about where we stand. On the one hand, we're seeing a proliferation of AI ethics principles or value statements which express ideals for achieving ethical AI. And we have a proliferation of toolkits like IBM Fairness 360 and other tools for extracting explanations from opaque algorithmic systems that we can apply to data sets. And we're not doing ethics for the first time. It goes back at least to Plato. We have other areas like biomedical ethics where we have long established norms that offer extremely concrete guidance. And just to add for my part, the industry partners I've worked with and those in the technology field that come up to me after I give talks on AI ethics are genuinely interested in realizing ethical AI. Of course, there's probably some selection bias in who invites us to give talks to them and who comes to talk to me after. But there's a real willingness, I think, on the part of industry to try to realize the promise of AI in an ethical fashion. But we do face significant challenges, and I'm going to identify just 4 important challenges, some of which the report is designed to address. So I'll just mention them all now, and then I'll talk about them a little more deeply in what follows. So first, existing regulatory guidance is inadequate. Second, we lack what I'm going to call systemic ethical capacity in the AI space. And what I mean by that is we don't have a fully developed set of resources, tools, norms, or interdisciplinary expertise yet in the ethics of AI. Third, the existing tools that we have, some of which I mentioned are not up to the task, they're very useful, the problems they were developed to solve, but they fall short of the way problems arise in the new space, this AI space. And finally, another obstacle is half education and half a PR problem. People, and by people I mean huge numbers of people outside of those developing these tools, don't understand how they work. And their confusion is a barrier to trust and accountability. I think a great example of this is the fact that people are so skeptical of the joint work between Apple and Google to develop COVID tracking apps. Like they give lots of information to Google for all sorts of things, but this was like a line in the sand, but it was actually an extremely privacy preserving technology. And if people understood how it worked, they would be less skeptical about it. And we would have gotten some of the benefits early in the pandemic. So let me talk about these challenges in a bit more detail. So I said that regulatory guidance is inadequate, and I think it's inadequate in at least 2 respects. First, the regulatory guidance we get is often unclear. So take the GDPR, for example, which provides significant regulatory guidance, but it also has lots of room for interpretation. So for example, the GDPR has a sort of transparency requirement. It requires something like transparency, where that's understood as the right to understand how the underlying logic of algorithmic systems work. But if you know how these systems work, then you know that it's sometimes extremely difficult to know whether you're in compliance with this requirement or not. And legal scholars that I've talked to aren't sure how to ensure compliance with that. Either they think it's easily satisfied or impossible to satisfy, and they're not sure how to think through that. Other places like, and that in some sense, those legal scholars are lucky because they at least have some guidance. Other places in the US just have far less regulatory guidance. Now, a second way in which regulatory guidance is inadequate is that regulatory compliance is a minimum standard for achieving ethical AI. Not all ethics should be enshrined in law, and what we owe to others, for example, consumers or customers, isn't exhausted by our legal requirements to them. So meeting mere legal requirements is not enough to engender trust. So even if we had good regulatory guidance, there'd still be lots of room to achieve ethical AI. The second challenge I raise has to do with systemic capacity. It's easiest to understand what I mean by that by contrasting the current state of bioethics or biomedical ethics with the current state of AI ethics. So biomedical ethics has longstanding guidelines for practitioners. Doctors and medical researchers receive relatively unified training and rules to follow. These rules are entrenched in the practice of medicine. There's concrete oversight infrastructure, and this varies from country to country, but there are oversight boards overseeing both human and animal subject research, and they work to ensure compliance with specific guidelines, and they review research before it starts. There are accountability frameworks built into that oversight. There are IRBs and other oversight committees that have real power to monitor and intervene. They have tools for auditing compliance with the norms. There are regular reviews to ensure, for example, that ethics infrastructure is living up to its responsibilities. Bioethics also has a robust research infrastructure. There are conferences to share work and the latest research, robust collections of case studies and training materials. And because of all that, participants in biomedical research and biomedical ethicists speak a common language. They can easily communicate concerns and justifications to one another. Finally, there's a group of people that are trained intermediaries between ethics and medicine and health research. Bioethicists are neither ethicists nor are they doctors, though sometimes that is their training. They're their own specialty, focused on drawing on and deploying the resources of ethics to solve ethical challenges in healthcare and healthcare research. If we contrast that with AI ethics, we just don't really have any of that. There's no concrete, robust oversight infrastructure. If there was, then this report probably wouldn't exist. There are no well-developed accountability frameworks. There are growing research programs and information exchange, but they're still disconnected, and key participants are sort of working in their own silos or bubbles. AI ethics specialists and industry partners aren't in close contact that often with one another. Instead, they're just on islands. Technical practitioners and ethical experts definitely do not speak a common language. When I talk about fairness and when my colleagues in computer science talk about fairness, we had to spend a lot of time translating what we mean to each other to be on the same page about issues of algorithmic fairness. Finally, we just don't yet have an equivalent to the biomedical ethicist, at least not as a profession. There are some small number of individuals that can serve this role, but not in a way that provides enough capacity, for example, for industry to be able to draw on them for their expertise. Now, I don't want to overstate things. The systemic capacity in medical ethics and research ethics isn't perfect, but still we face a much steeper hill to climb here in the AI realm. Given that we have systemic capacity in bioethics, you might wonder why we can't just borrow and deploy that infrastructure to achieve ethical AI. And that brings us to the third challenge I mentioned. The existing norms and frameworks we have, including those of bioethics, are inadequate. And to better articulate why, I'm going to walk through just one example. I have two listed here, but I'm just going to talk about one. First, let's start with an example where norms from bioethics have been adapted for use in technology spaces. It's an essential part of biomedical research that research participants give informed consent and provide a token of that consent, usually a signature. This requirement of informed consent is seen as a tool for meeting ethical requirements to respect participants' autonomy and ultimately show respect for persons. In the sphere of software, the internet, and collecting user data online, a sort of version of informed consent that is sometimes called notice and consent has been widely adopted. Users are presented with a disclosure about how their data will be used, for example. They're given access to a bunch of legalese, and then they're asked to click to signal consent to the policies governing data use. Now, one way to understand what's going on here is that we see a useful, measurable, verifiable tool that helps to realize a value in one context, biomedical research, and we want to realize that same value in another context. So we adopt a version of that tool. The problem is that notice and consent doesn't achieve the goals or ends of protecting and promoting values the way informed consent does in biomedical research. Informed consent isn't just a matter of research participants signing off on a document. It exists within a robust ethics ecosystem that was designed specifically to protect and promote values as they relate to the context of biomedical research. So those consent procedures themselves are evaluated by a committee, and they evaluate whether all appropriate information is disclosed, whether it's disclosed in a way that a reasonable person can understand, and they evaluate whether there's any undue inducement in getting participants to consent, evaluating, for example, the benefits or incentive used to entice participation. Now, the infrastructure that supports and structures consent by research petitions is what really ensures that the tool or metric for realizing the values actually does so. Notice and consent doesn't exist within that kind of infrastructure, so we have no real resources for ensuring that people's consent to an agreement in this context meets ethical requirements or provides genuine informed consent. So at the very least, we would need to borrow a lot more from bioethics to make it a workable tool. I'll just briefly say something about fairness where it's a different kind of problem. Here, we've had a proliferation of tools or frameworks being developed specifically to address fairness in AI, and we have all these metrics that we can use. So we have measurable guiding tools. We can assess certain outcomes by an algorithmic system as fair or unfair. But the problem is we get very little guidance about which of those fairness metrics to use, or even whether a fairness metric is the right way to think about fairness in a given context. So even though we have the appearance of norms that are grounded specifically to address AI, we actually don't have any foundation for deciding between the different possible measurable metrics that are there. A final challenge, especially I think to building trust in these systems, that these technologies are just very poorly understood. Now I have here a picture of an autonomous vehicle because I think the discussion of how so-called trolley cases relate to autonomous driving accident scenarios is emblematic of a fundamental misunderstanding of how machine learning works. People think about AI as just really sophisticated programming that some programmer has full control over and specifies the behavior of these systems. They don't understand that these systems are much more like pets trained on a subset of all possible scenarios and left to extrapolate to the broader context. Not understanding that and many other features of these technologies makes it difficult for stakeholders to advocate for themselves in useful ways and hard to explain what's driving the behavior of systems they interact with. This, I think, extends across the space of AI and big data tech. It impacts not just consumers, but policymakers and many people within organizations that develop and deploy these technologies. So these are 4 important obstacles, in my view, to achieving ethical AI. And the problem isn't just that we can't use notice and consent or anonymization or have to manage fairness metrics. They're systemic across the entire technology space. So what do we go from here? And this really gets at what the report is meant to help address. Well, we certainly need to build up ethical capacity, and we need to educate the public, and we need policymakers to develop informed and informative regulation. But a key component of moving towards ethical AI involves a process of defining and clarifying values and using them as a foundation in part of a process for developing commitments, that is action guiding, and specifications that are tools for assessing progress. It's extremely difficult to develop commitments and specifications that are both meaningful and verifiable. And this kind of normative work, going through this process of creating those those commitments and specifications in light of values and connecting them up and doing that critical work, is critical to achieving ethical AI. Again, bioethics provides a nice example of this process in action. An area where I have some personal experiences as a member of an animal care and use committee. These are the committees that provide oversight for the use of federally funded animal subjects research in the US. The guidance for how to conduct oversight and the specific tasks that these committees undertake are embedded in a framework that connects up to fundamental values. The fundamental value is roughly to not treat animals wastefully. And this gets packed in terms of what are called the 3 Rs: replacement, reduction, refinement. Researchers submit protocols in a predefined format. They provide information for examining, for example, a detailed literature review to show that the use of a given type of animal subject and a total number of subjects is appropriate for a given research program, that the research isn't repeating previous work and would thus be wasteful. There are requirements to specify how animals would be housed, fed, what procedures will be done. These protocols are reviewed by a committee and then, if approved, renewed every year with some inspections. Here, the primary stakeholder to whom research orgs are accountable is the federal government, but the protocol evaluation process and the commitments and specifications embedded in it yield verifiable outputs that are carefully chosen because of the way they relate to core values of scientific progress and animal welfare. Going through this process yields not only coherent guidance and tools for assessment, which are a foundation for accountability infrastructure, but going through the process in this way is what ensures that the guidance and assessment we have is value responsive. The guidance and assessment tools the process yields are informed from the start by the values, the foundational values that we set out to promote and protect. And because the process yields a coherent story about how the values ultimately ground guidance and assessment, the story can be explained to others and hopefully build trust that the decisions being made by algorithm systems align with shared values. So that provides some broader context for the report. I think I'm now going to turn maybe back to Julian, but to Stephen to talk about his side of things and the connection with industry partners.
Thank you so much, John, for that tour de force through the report. Certainly much appreciated. Stephen, you've been closely affiliated with the GeoTech Center and a frequent contributor. So we're very excited that you're joining us in this capacity yet again. You're an expert in data ethics and responsible innovation at Accenture, and the stage is yours, please.
Thank you. I really liked how this conversation started out talking about philosopher kings. It really kind of comes back to when John and Ron and I first started working together a number of years ago. And, all of us kind of thinking like, oh, this is, I remember Ron really perked up. He thought, AI ethics is full employment for philosophers, and or represented that potential. And I think we all kind of got excited about that, because kind of bringing in that depth of thought and rigor to decision making was really something we saw as needing and lacking, and this notion that we would have these moral guides to kind of be our Sherpas through this process was a really encouraging thing. It hasn't quite played out that way yet, but sometimes timing is off. So we hold that prospect in the future. You know, it's interesting to me. I was talking, there was a number of things that resonated here with a conversation I had earlier this week with a property manager and developer who was looking at health and human safety changes as a result of COVID-19 in commercial properties around the world. And, you know, essentially this means tracking people within organizations. And it comes down to a lot of these questions around, you know, ethics. Is it okay to do that? We look at, you know, just as you know, philosophers tend to look at, you know, the bioethics because they have a 50+ year head start on what we're doing. You know, we look for corollaries in other areas. So in oil and gas, for instance, you know, health and human safety has been a reason to have badged tracking on employees. If I need to vent a dangerous gas to a space, I want to make sure there's nobody in that space. And the easiest way to do that is to have badge tracking and make sure there's safe around there. In other parts of the world, you have people who have kind of time worked as a condition of employment. So if you don't work the full you know, shift that you're supposed to, that's a fireable offense. And so you have different kind of standards that you have in different industries in different parts of the world for managing that type of interaction. And they were really struggling with this notion that, look, I need to account for all of these different local cultural customs in the work that we're doing as we're developing an ethical response to kind of employee tracking. And how do we really do that in a scalable way? And that's something that the work that we've done and that we're talking about here is really trying to address that notion that we can have different norms in different parts of the world, and it's all part of the same system. And those cultural contexts can be taken into account. So a couple good examples of where this is being done today, right? I think one of the things that caused us to kind of iterate one more time was a number of the commitments that we're seeing in the marketplace to, you know, inclusion and diversity in hiring and retention practices. And a lot of times we felt that, you know, we would see a press release about it or we would see some kind of announcement, and then it really felt like that was it. And the information that the organization was sharing as to, you know, how, you know, what precisely is our commitment in this space? How can you hold us accountable? How can we measure our progress? What are we disclosing? How are we being transparent about these metrics? That seemed to be lacking. And so what we saw was a lot of organizations having this desire, but maybe on the back end, less maturity in how to achieve that desire. And you know, we've seen this in other areas as well. We're currently applying this work. We'll see in a couple months, either in November or December, a regulator, a financial services regulator in Asia will be publishing some guidance that this work helps to support. And one of the things that is of concern to banks and insurers is really that localization as well. So for instance, you know, Muslim sensitive banking does not allow for interest to be charged on loans. You know, they're happy to pay fees, but part of that, you know, making money is not something that culture wants to participate in. And so we have to be sensitive to that. We have to allow one organization with a global presence to be able to take in different types of business models based upon the cultures in which they're doing business. We further get to some questions, kind of some classical questions in lending that different organizations might respond to in different ways, but without a framework for really evaluating what those responses might be, it becomes really challenging. So for instance, if there is bias discovered that an organization had deployed some kind of decision-making AI in loan decisions, and there is bias that is later discovered that for this very narrow group, these people were getting denied, and they should have not been denied in that fashion, there might have been an opportunity for recourse for these folks, or maybe there was a loan that could have been underwritten. What is the obligation to go back and let those people know that their circumstances could have changed, or that maybe the life experience or the life trajectory that they had that may have been influenced by that negative decision could in fact be changed? What about when a bank detects there's fraud in an application? What are the obligations, moral, legal, et cetera, for letting someone know why they were denied? If my algorithms detect a high degree of high likelihood of fraud, should I have to disclose that? Or would I be giving a fraudster more ammunition from which they can game the system in the future? And these are really challenging questions. And we want to bring forth this notion that organizations don't necessarily need to have a uniform response across the board. Each organization can make a response that is contextual and relevant to what they're doing and the cultures and systems that they want to protect and promote and operate within. And so as we deploy this in different contexts, I think the power is really coming out that we are able to affect change across a wide array of industries, of geographies, and really have something that is sustainable and scalable in many different contexts. And that's really exciting to me. And hopefully we've assembled a panel here that can talk to that wide range of folks as well. And so Julian, I'll hand it back over to you to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And before I'd like to turn it over to the panel who helps us walk through kind of those real world implications of the more philosophical topics that we've discussed. I actually like to stay on the topic of philosophy really quick and bring in Ronald Sandler, who's a co-author of the report and the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. Ronald, really quick, if we think about the concept of bounded rationality that Herbert Simon introduced, and basically say that AI systems will be better at decision makings because they have more data to gather information from. Can the same be said about ethics? Are they going to be the better humans if we do it the right way and install the right morals, so to say?
Well, you want to say very philosophy on that. A lot goes back to what John said. So the systems themselves aren't moral agents, right? So they're not going to be morally responsible for this or that and the other thing. It's going to come a lot down to the ways in which we design them in value-sensitive ways, the ways in which we're able to think about justice and transparency, privacy, autonomy in the construction of the systems, and the way in which we deploy them as human-machine techno-social systems, which is what they really are, right? So we're not, it's very unlikely that you're going to have these independent systems off and running and making moral decisions and all these sorts of things. That's not what this is about. It's about how do you develop the systems in a way that are value-informed? How do you implement them ways, as Stephen was talking about, that's highly contextual and that embodies the principles that the organizations or the governmental entities that are committed to, right? Those commitments to justice and transparency and privacy and autonomy and the social good. How do those things get realized in the construction and then the deployment of these systems? And it's, as John was saying, it's very difficult. It's a difficult thing to do. It's an easy thing to do to say that you're for justice and transparency and privacy. It's a very difficult thing to do to think about how to build the organizational capacity to specify what those mean, build the systems by which you're going to implement them, design the measures that they're then going to use to ensure that they're actually implemented. And that's what this report is about. It's about the commitment that's involved and the steps that are involved in that process, getting from these very general abstract, almost philosophical concepts like justice and privacy and transparency to very measurable metrics that can be implemented, that can be used by regulators, that can hold organizations accountable.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'd like to now welcome Joe, Nell, and Kirk also to the stage, who will help us, somewhat get an expert reaction. And Joe, maybe I'll turn it over to you first, since you're coming from the Department of Defense, and they make a big, take quite a bit of pride in the fact that they have the policy that there's always going to be a human in the decision-making cycle. Is that, so to say, the guardrail for preventing failed ethics? Thinking about autonomous weapon system as, so to say, the systems that have the ultimate choice, choosing between life and death. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. Please, stage is yours.
Thank you, Julian. I appreciate it. Thank you to my esteemed panelists. I think this report is kind of timely, as I always do every time I do an Atlantic Council discussion. The views that I'm about to say are my views of my own, and these do not represent the U.S. government or the Department of Defense. Moving forward with your question, though, I do believe that the Department of Defense is going to continue to have someone in that loop. We have to have someone in that loop. We have tons of lives on the line. But I do think we are going to go to a process where we are able to have smaller projects and smaller mission-based systems that are autonomous at the end of the day. Nothing that's going to be, nothing that's going to have a kill switch on it. That just requires a human in that loop. If you've read the report, you know that these things are very, you're basing things off of the data that you have in the moment. And so you're making a decision, and that decision really needs to go back and get kicked back to a human. We don't want to rely on machines to do these things for us and to monitor these things, but we do appreciate when they are able to find anomalies in the system. They are able to take images where we didn't think their images were going to be, that needed to be taken rather. And so these are smaller things that don't necessarily interrupt the daily activities of the lives of the Department of Defense or anybody else. And so I don't think in any time in the near future, we're not going to have, as we like to say, Terminator systems coming out and making decisions that say, all humans are bad for the earth, and so we're going to eradicate them. We're not worried about that, and that's not coming anytime soon. But it is something that I think this report is laying a foundation that I think everybody should read, because we really need to understand what are the actionable items, right? It's all good and well to sing the praises of we want to be charitable, but how do we actually do that, and how do we measure that? And I can tell you for sure that the department is basically definitely looking at what we consider success and what we consider actionable and measurable.
Thanks, Joe. Well, let's stay on the topic of this notion that all humans are bad and that AI systems are going to make their own decisions. I want to bring in Nell here really quick. You're a machine intelligence researcher who helps pioneer deep machine vision through your company. If we move forward with general AI, do you think we should fear a world in which AI systems are going to develop their own morals?
Wow, it's an interesting question. Throughout human history, we have developed different ways of understanding morality, whether it's, say, Bentham and utilitarianism, or, for example, sort of deontological ways of deciding that something should always be done, even if it's rather inconvenient. And these different ways of understanding morality together in combination and trading off with each other can give us a better understanding of a situation of ethical or moral import. It's possible that extremely advanced intelligence may develop its own system of ethics, perhaps based on entropic principles from physics, for example. Maximizing freedom and minimizing entropy might be the ultimate ethical maxim to such a system. That may have implications upon our society. Perhaps some human beings might think, oh, this is an interesting way of looking at the world. Others may prefer to keep their own moral systems and values for themselves. I do think that this report will definitely help to improve the corrigibility of advanced intelligent systems, enabling us to better understand how those systems function in their transparency, as well as better informing what kinds of values we should consider loading into those systems.
Thank you. Now, before I turn it over to Kirk, for Ronald and John, when I read the report, it became obvious to me that, the entire debate about ethics and morals and what Nell just alluded to, what kind of morals we hold dear, it is a rather individualist-centric notion of, thinking about the implications when you look at bioethics and you talk about those different trials. People need to be informed. Thinking about the global nature of technology, of artificial intelligence, how do you see an opportunity to bridge cultural differences when it comes to morals, when it comes to different values that societies have? Are we going to have a car that in one country runs over the old person and in the other country the family, given the different value of those societies? Be curious to hear your thoughts. Maybe John, you go first. I saw you unmuted yourself.
Sure. I guess my tongue-in-cheek answer is whatever the philosopher king decides. But the real answer is something like the report as it's written is not, me and Ron have particular views about what the right foundational values are. But the report is really set up to be neutral and sort of say, you tell us what your foundational values are, and let's walk you through a process of getting that to outcomes. And so we don't want to really take a stance or use the American values or that privacy is the dominant value or anything like that. In a certain sense, it's for organizations to decide how they want to live up to this, and it's for societies to decide whether they've chosen the right values, because they'll at least be in a position to see, given the norms you've adopted and the values you're trying to realize, we don't like that or we do like that. And some of that's going to be through a collaborative or antagonistic process of back and forth, the way we often solve ethical problems in the face of reasonable disagreement about which values are correct. So the question of autonomous vehicles, should we have cars that in one country do one thing versus the other? It sort of depends on what your views about political philosophy are and how to settle those questions. Some people are going to say, look, there's a right answer and it's culturally independent. Or at least they might admit there's a pluralism of right answers, but there's also some wrong answers. But I want to try avoiding taking a stance on what those particular ones are, at least for this, because we want this report to be useful, whatever your answer to that question is.
Ronald, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add too that the context sensitivity is a huge part of the process of translating those principles into actionable items in the report. Because, look, it would be great. In a certain sense, it would make AI and data ethics very easy if we could say, for example, to take justice. If justice were one thing, there was one principle, there was one way to operationalize it, and there was one metric that you implemented in the systems and you used to measure, right? That would be great. But the reality is it's nothing like that at all, right? And what the report is about is the complexities of trying to understand what a commitment to justice is, and why it is that a commitment to justice or transparency or privacy, these other values, whatever the foundational values are that the organization is committed to, why it's so important and why it's so hard to specify more concretely and more particularly what that commitment means and how that differs by cultural context, by organizational context, by the type of sector, by institutional responsibilities. There's all sorts of things that go into defining what a general commitment of justice means in particular. It's going to be different across cultures. It's going to be different in criminal justice context than in financial services context than in educational context. And so what the report does, it talks about the importance of the process of getting those specifications done so that the organization can move towards more concrete implementations.
Thank you. I want to bring in Kirk. Kirk, you're a chief architect and VP at Hewlett Packard Labs in Palo Alto. Talking about those real world implications, can you share a little bit about your company's journey when it comes to data ethics and where that kind of maturity journey would benefit from an analysis as we've been provided to today?
Certainly, Julian, and you're right. You know, my day job is chief architect at Labs as part of Hewlett Packard Enterprise. But one of my side hustles has been, along with great cooperation from many leads in our HP Global Compliance community, we have been drafting our global HPE AI ethics review board and principles over the last 18 months. And it was interesting, as I read the report, it was like, oh, okay, I'm not alone. We're not alone, because that same process that we've gone through, first to identify the core values, and actually think we were fortunate in that ours are already well articulated, but then to generate those AI ethics principles for Hewlett Packard Enterprise, authentic to our purpose and authentic into the ways in which we participate, and to everyone that we want to provide guidance to across the company. I thought it was going to take 6 weeks for myself and my co-lead, Amy Holcroft, who's our chief privacy officer, to draft the AI ethics principles that were authentic to our purpose. It took us 18 months. And it was really an amazing process to go through. You know, we, as I said, I think we had a leg up because we had a purpose. You know, and you go back to 1960, and Dave Packard, he said our purpose as Hewlett Packard was to make a contribution to society in a way that is unique, that we come together because we do things that we could not do individually. And the way our current CEO, Antonio Neri, now here in 2021, succinctly puts it, HPE exists to advance the way people live and work. So we can already put that at the top of our whiteboard, and then to actually talk about the principles that we wanted to hold up. And here we want to remember that, you know, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, we're not just contributing into these solutions, but we're a Fortune 100 company. So we are consuming these to improve our processes, as well as incorporating AI to make our products and services better. And finally, we contribute to global infrastructure for others to partner with us and to then utilize our services and products to develop AI systems themselves. So it was interesting to see how it kept growing. The groups that we wanted to provide guidance to have the principles, and we did finally come up. We came up with 5 principles that really reflected the values, our purpose, and that we thought were interesting tools. And now we're at that point, just like this conversation today. It's one thing to write down your principles. It's another thing to give people the tools necessary to live those principles out in the thousands of decisions that they make every single day. I think we went in perhaps a little naively, and I think we had, again, benefit because of great cooperation with our compliance office. They had already gone through our human rights process and developing that structure. This one, we thought that would give us an advantage, and I think it did. But still, it was even more complex, again, giving product and process and partnership we wanted to inform. And so what it left us to was we could develop the principles, we could develop educational materials about the principles and why these were authentically reflected our purpose and should intersect all 60,000 employees, all 140 countries where we do business, as guidance. But we are now at that next step, which is working with each of these communities to then interpret the principles, document the decisions that they are making with our assistance, and then just to collect that body of experience. And I think that's really where we find ourselves right now. We have great support from our leadership team, and that is not the least in part due to the fact that this is now becoming a competitive requirement. Depending on which jurisdiction you are in the world, they will have, you saw that one of the opening slides, that matrix of all the organizations that are putting forth the principles and frameworks. Well, now we are going through the process of interpreting our principles, mapping them onto different jurisdictions so we can bid, so that we can actually bid for, you know, intelligent social infrastructure or major projects globally, and know that we are, one, maintaining adherence to our principles, but also being able to reflect those natively to the principles wherever we are trying to partner.
Kirk, allow me to be a little bit provocative, and I also like to address this question to Stephen. You know, coming from Germany, there's a very different perception of the responsibility of corporations, right? In Germany, everybody is afraid of uploading pictures to Facebook because of privacy concerns, yet nobody has a problem with the government collecting travel information at the airport. In America, my experience, it's exactly the other way around. So from a societal perspective, do we need to rely on boardrooms making the right decisions for those standards, or should it be up to regulators, democratic processes to force companies to apply a certain rule of the road?
Well, it's interesting. One of the most debated topics when we were defining our principles, there was at one point where one of the principles had the phrase, obey the rule of law. And we thought, we argued a lot about that one because, as you say, there are so many jurisdictions in which we operate. The one thing, though, we came around to was what there is a universal declaration is there's a universal declaration of human rights. And so for us, that's what we ended up including as the guiding principle, especially since we already had a human rights compliance organization and mechanism, and we had great support and buy-in, again, across the breadth of the enterprise, not just in the products we create, but also in the partnerships that we found and in the processes that we consume facing our own employees as well as our customers. So that's where we ended up, understanding that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that touchstone regardless of where we operate. And then we will look at individual engagements, and that does factor in. And it will be interesting, as you might imagine, technologies like facial recognition and how that is used different places globally. That is certainly, that was the number one case that was beginning to build up that body of guidance and experience and understanding and case studies, so that we can look at that intersection, because it won't be the same everywhere in the world. And so that's where the Declaration of Human Rights was that overarching thing we could include that's global, and the rest is part of a vibrant discussion on a case-by-case basis.
Stephen, your thoughts with regards to that question? Would you support the notion that Kirk just introduced?
Yeah, I think, I think that's very much the case, but I look at it a little bit differently. So I look at it from a standpoint of, what really spurs regulation. And I think that organizations, companies in particular, have a big opportunity to really get out in front of this. Leaders set compliance frameworks. Governments tend to follow. Now, European regulators are a little bit different than US regulators, right? Where European regulators tend to, have a kind of a group of experts that publish some kind of, this is what we're thinking about. They get a lot of comments back, and it seems to be a bit more agile. Whereas US regulators tend to, want to do a lot of stakeholder engagement, get similar feedback, but then they want to carve something in stone. That will likely not have as much of a ability to be edited, in the near future. And I think that both systems have, pluses and minuses, but we've certainly seen the agility with the European version of that much more so than the US version of that. So I think that, even my comments have to be caveated from kind of where in the world is that happening. But certainly in the US, we see companies having a great ability to affect regulation. And governments will follow what companies that are out in front are doing. Leaders don't follow compliance frameworks, they set them.
Joe, I'd like to pick your brain about this process. The military has for a really long time been an absolute leader of innovation, technical progress and process. So, when new technologies are getting applied, when a private-public partnership is being established and really cutting-edge research is being done, what are the supervisory boards? How does the decision-making function to make sure that they are in accordance with values, with privacy standards, so on and so forth?
I think the military. The military and just the federal government as a whole. If you've ever read the 2,200 pages of the FAR, which is kind of the federal acquisition regulations, you start to see that built into that kind of synergy is that we want to make sure that we provide transparency. I'm not saying we do it all the time, and I'm not saying we do the best job of it. So I should lead with that. But we want to ensure that we provide transparency to all of the folks that are trying to do work with the DoD. So I think I should take a step back. A lot of the innovation that we have from the DoD actually comes out of universities, and they come out of innovations for, what do we call these here? Where industry does their own research. The name of the acronym is slipping me at the moment. But when we're doing these things and when we're working with these industries and we're working with these universities, they do have to adhere to kind of our transparency, our privacy, and our equity, acts that are kind of the foundation, right? So our U.S. has a history that is kind of bound in a lot of turmoil for less disenfranchised groups, and so as we move forward. When we do innovation, the DoD is really focused on making sure that we have a council of folks that are there that are making sure that we're covering all of our corners, dotting all of our T's, and dotting all of our I's and crossing all of our T's when we're doing a new innovation or when we're putting something out for the soldiers to use. I think that the federal government is, like I said again, doing a pretty good job of trying to make sure these things are equitable. But the thing I'm interested in from this particular document is that we talk about ethics, right? And so there's a code of ethics that comes from the military that is incorporated in every single thing that we do as we move forward. But AI is just such a new technology, and how do we incorporate these ethics into something that is not human-based, right? And so that is something that I think is interesting and something that the DoD is watching to see what other agencies, your Googles and your HPs and your Apples, what are they doing in kind of the self-governance? And so Stephen and I talked the other day about this, and it's like we're counting on these major platforms to govern themselves and to self-report, and there's no regulations behind that. And I think that's something that this report helps to lead to. Like, you need to have these folks on the ground in order to really make sure that they're leading the front. They're on the front of these things, and they're leading this. And so we want to make sure that as they police themselves, we understand what's going on. And so, the transparency and the justice and kind of the sense making that goes through all of this to really build trust in the system has to really come, I think, really from the industry, because this is a new wave for the DoD and for the federal government. We're behind. It is what it is. I hate to put it so bluntly, but we are really following what the industry is going to do on this.
If I could build on that just a little bit, I think one of the really important parts of this is the accountability and transparency kind of that comes at the end. What are those commitments and how are you measuring them? And as regulators are looking at, kind of regulating the tech industry, we actually have another report that's coming out that'll be about kind of framework for regulatory opportunities. But there's, this notion of what do we want to require? And what kind of information do we want to be transparent about so that, we can hold the right parties accountable? And I think that as organizations work through this framework, that governments can pay attention and look to things that they might want to know. They might want to know specific things for specific sectors, for instance, right? For social media, there might be a certain set of cares that governments have. For employment AIs, there might be a certain set of concerns that governments have that they want disclosure about, that they want to have some kind of accountability or accountable party, that there's data that's consistent across firms that's being shared and in consistent ways where that information can be compared both within and across industries. So, I think that is really an important part of this work, that accountability that we want to kind of double click on as well.
Now, I want to bring you in. What about the industry perspective? Is it also kind of like a try and error principle, or are you looking for guidance? Where do you find that notion that Joe described? Where do you think the private sector, particularly, small and startups are looking for when they develop those systems?
I think that there are a number of different ways that we can examine standardization and certification, not only of systems, but also the people behind them. If we think about the black boxes on commercial aircraft, there is a cockpit voice recorder for the human element, and there is a flight instrumentation recorder for the machine element. And both of those are essential to really understanding what happens during an incident, because it's very rarely just, one side of that equation is the issue. It's usually some kind of combination. And I think it's therefore important that we get transparency not only into systems, but also into organizations, the incentives which may lurk within those organizations, and perhaps increasingly into the certification of personnel, so they are trained in how to deal with ethical issues, what kinds of ethical issues they might encounter, how to broach those within the organization to ensure that they are listened to and they are actioned in some way. I think it's still so much early days, and there's tremendous opportunities for organizations to take the initiative to lead the way ahead. And I'm delighted to see the Atlantic Council leading these initiatives with such fervor.
Well, you're being too kind. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to turn it back to the authors of the report. And kind of really, after this discussion, obviously there's so much substance and so much need for a discussion, quite frankly. How do you imagine your work being adopted, both by the private, by the public sector, moving forward? What would you imagine being an ideal scenario, and how could companies benefit from those rather philosophical discussions that are outlined in your report? Maybe we start with Ron this time around and then turn it over to John.
Sure. So, the motivate, in a certain sense, the motivation behind the report does start with the adoption of these AI and data ethic principles, right? You just see them adopted everywhere, right? Everybody's committed to these things. But as has come out in this discussion, and Kirk has talked about it, Nell and Stephen and everyone, taking those principles and getting them to something that's actually useful is not just hard. Right? It takes a huge amount of organizational commitment, right? What expected to be 6 weeks is 18 months before the implementation, as Kirk was saying, right? So there's a huge amount of work that has to go on. Why is it so hard? It's so hard for the reasons that John talked about at the beginning, which is that we lack capacity. There aren't established norms, best practices, regulations, expertise, expert guidance, all of the resources that we see in areas like bioethics that take those general principles and translate them into very specific things. They're in development now for AI and data ethics. They're not mature. They don't exist in some cases. So what this report is, what we hope the report will be, is a resource that is helpful to organizations who are undergoing this process, right? It's one resource of what is a huge social AI, data, big data, computationally driven decision-making systems. Like this is, we're not talking about, like bioethics has to do with the medical field, right? And medical research, these sorts of things. That's it. But AI and data and computation, this is much broader. This isn't just medical. This is everything, right? Information, defense, financial services, education, it's everything. So we really, really, really need to build enormous capacity, social capacity, best practices, expertise, training programs, expectations, all of these sorts of things. This report is one piece, right? One small contribution to organizations that want to go from those principles to implementation that can help. It's meant to be a guidance document, right, along that process and what's involved. And I think this is sometimes we hear talk of AI and data ethics washing, right? This idea that these principles will come out and nobody will actually do anything about them. I don't think it's, the challenge isn't that, in our experience, that people or companies or organizations don't want to do anything. It's that they don't know how. They don't know how to get started. And so this is really about, how do you get started? You start with principle of justice. What are the first steps you need to take to get down the road towards implementation? So that would be ideal.
John, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly build on it and say another motivational report is like we see a lot of people that are making mistakes in ethics, like they glom onto a view about transparency or fairness, and that really can muck things up and make things worse than they were because they haven't gone through that process. But what I'd like to see come out of the report is people having the realization that Kirk did and trying to pull in a diverse range of experts from across disciplines and other organizations to sort of build something usable and measurable that can help encourage accountability. And so I hope what it creates is lots of collaborations to do the work that the report points out needs doing and sort of provides a framework for doing, but doesn't actually do. And I think we're just going to be better off if academics and industry partners are working together on these problems. And that's not just to ensure my own employment going forward or anything like that. But I really think the work will be better if we can create those connections.
Well, thank you very much to all of you and to our listeners. My colleague Kieran just dropped a link to the report. Yet again, I can highly encourage you to read it. It's a fascinating read through, and maybe, we started with Plato, maybe we can conclude with it. Not all philosophers must be kings, but it's certainly worthwhile if kings talk to philosophers to get some good ideas. With that, I thank you once again, and I hope you all have a good evening, good day from wherever you're joining us. Thank you very much.